Okay, I'm back on.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, sorry about that. There is a bit of technical difficulties.
Okay, I'm on. I hear your voice, Matteo. Frank and Paul on?
Yeah, I'm just gonna make sure that Paul and Frank are on. Just give me 1 second. Oh, okay, Paul is on.
Okay, set. Okay, I'm on.
Okay, perfect. So we can begin whenever you guys want.
Let's begin now.
Okay, I'm ready anytime.
Okay, Frank, do you want to start?
Okay, all right, you all set?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm back on.
All right,
Okay,
good morning.
perfect.
My
Yeah,
name is
sorry
Frank
about that. There is a
Leffler,
bit of technical difficulties.
and I am the executive partner of MK Trade Compliance Group, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our webinar today for the ITAR and the EAR rules for space-related exports. Our presenter today, Chuck Shotwell, is uniquely positioned to provide valuable insights into the list changes moving thousands of items from the USML to the CCL. And since 1986, our experienced team at MK Trade Compliance has provided a full range of consulting services, including compliance audits and evaluations, enforcement assessments, internal compliance program reviews, and I should also highlight as well our classification services, because proper classification is the foundation of any compliance program, especially in light of the ongoing export reform process. So let us help you avoid the cost of export violations or unnecessarily restrictive classifications. And I would also note that for the soccer fans in our audience, in light of the US-Germany match, the webinar will be uploaded by the end of the day onto our website. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Chairman and CEO Paul Friedenberg.
Thank you, Frank. We're very lucky today to have Chuck Shotwell with us to talk about the issue. Chuck served as the director of the Office of Defense Trade Controls Policy at DDTC from 2009 to 2012, which culminated a 30-year career of government service. As you know, DDTC handles the munitions list, includes such things as conventional, chemical, and biological weapons, as well as today's topic of space technology. And as the head of DDTC and the chief negotiator in this area, he was probably the most important figure in negotiating on behalf of DDTC the ITAR movement of products over to the Commerce Control List, and as well as reforming the commodity jurisdiction process. Chuck will speak in a moment. We're going to have future programs, including discussions of both Category 11 and 12, and also we are planning a program on mastering the ITAR. With that, I think I'll turn things over to Chuck Shotwell. Why don't you go ahead, Chuck?
Okay, thanks, Paul. So let's review the program agenda for today. We're going to talk about the status of ITAR reforms with a focus on changes to ITAR Category 15, that is satellite spacecraft and related hardware and technology and components. We'll also be talking about Category 4, which is launch vehicles. Secondly, we'll take a look at those changes in the context of impact on today's emerging space industry. We'll then talk about best practices to implement those changes. Next, we'll look at what's ahead for export control reform. We'll then take audience questions, and finally, we'll wrap up with key takeaways. So, looking at export control reforms, important milestones have been met. The reform effort, which began in August 2009, as many of you will know, with the formation of the Export Control Reform Task Force. And the idea was moving items of lesser concern from the ITAR and the U.S. munitions list over to the Export Administration Regulations and the Commerce Control List, CCL. And USML, U.S. munitions list revisions have been published on a rolling basis and likely will continue at least through next year, through 2015. But let's look at where we are so far. We've had 8 categories completed, published, and are now in the process of implementation. 5 more categories will go into effect in July, which includes Category 4 launch vehicles, which we'll talk about today, and 1 more in November, and that is Category 15, which we'll also be talking about today. We have 3 categories currently under interagency review, 3 categories on hold, and 1 category pending. That's Category 11, military electronics, which just recently cleared its 38F notification to Congress. So we should expect something shortly on military electronics, Category 11. In any event, the purpose of regulatory reform was to increase transparency. The intent was to move from subjective controls to more objective controls with the goal of providing greater certainty for jurisdiction between the Commerce Control List and the U.S. Munitions List. And this was done specifically through a paradigm shift, moving away from the old broad generic catch-all controls of the ITAR and moving towards positive enumerated lists. And these, the positive list would be based on specific performance criteria and capabilities, and in some cases based on specifically designed or specially designed criteria. This new idea, specially designed. It's a language that's used in a lot of the international export control regimes as well as Commerce Department. So it was an attempt at a beginning towards convergence between the State Department and Commerce Department export controls. In any event, this effort involved great coordination between the Departments of Defense, Commerce, and State Department in identifying items of unique and critical military and intelligence value, and then moving the lesser items of lesser concern from a national security perspective, from the U.S. munitions list to the Commerce Control List. And hence, on the commerce side, the new Commerce Control List 600 series, and more specifically the 500 series for space-related items, were set up. By the way, I will note that when I use the term 500 series, I mean the space and satellite-related ECCNs, and I'm not referring to the pre-existing 521 ECCN. But the impact is quite significant. Of the 85,000 or so licenses that DDTC has averaged in recent years, we expect about 50% of those items to be moved over. And most of those are in the aerospace area. So there's a big impact ahead for industry. In fact, if you look at the statistics, it's already impacting the number of licenses in State Department and Commerce Department. So when we look at the area of space, it's very unique to the area of export control reforms, much more of a unique history because it's been singled out for special attention by Congress and the executive branch. And to fully understand where we are now, we really do need to go back at least just briefly over the last 20 years. Back in the 1990s, commercial communication satellites were moved from the U.S. munitions list to the Commerce Control List. And by the way, that was done with great bipartisan support at the time. Flash forward a few years later, 1996, there was a crash of a launch vehicle with a satellite in China. That satellite had an encrypted circuit board. There are allegations of assistance with telemetry data for launch vehicles, which in that case happened to be Chinese Long March missiles. There are a few other incidents and cases which cause concern. There was a reaction on Capitol Hill. The reaction was the Strom Thurmond National Defense Authorization Act of 1999, which moved those commercial communication satellites back to the U.S. munitions list and all the components and related technologies. And very significantly, at least as importantly, Congress removed the authority that the President normally has under the Arms Export Control Act to be able to move things back from the U.S. munitions list to the Commerce Control List. It removed that presidential discretion and presidential authority that normally exists under the Arms Export Control Act. The result was that Category 15 comprehensively controlled satellites, spacecraft, and related articles. There were a few exceptions, but for the most part, the controls resided on the USML side. There were complaints from industry with some justification that these controls were overly broad and that they contributed to the ITAR free movement, which was growing in Europe and elsewhere around the world, and that these controls deprived U.S. industry of billions of dollars of lost sales by restricting exports, many of which were not necessarily of, or were of at least questionable national security value. Flash forward 11 years later, the National Defense Authorization Act of fiscal year 2010 directed that DoD and state conduct a study and assessment of risks. There have been great changes in the space industry in the meantime, of course, with the shift to even NASA depending on the commercial domestic space launch industry for support for the International Space Station, for example, and other projects. Recognition that we needed to keep that the space industry, domestic space industry, healthy. Anyway, the report or study known as the 1248 report was completed, presented to Congress in April of 2012, and the intent was, in the study, did identify technologies, certain satellites and components, without technologies that were unique to the U.S., and those technologies not critical to national security, and those items that would be more appropriately controlled by the EAR. So the focus was that on spacecraft and space vehicles and satellites with unique military and intelligence functions. And consequently, after that report, the National Defense Authorization Act of fiscal year 2013, that was actually gave back presidential discretion regarding the transfer of satellites and related items, repealed the 1999 Strom-Thurmond law, but at the same time kept certain prohibited destinations. Think China, North Korea, Iran, Cuba. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Very significantly, that led to the new rule that we're going to talk about today, Category 15, spacecraft, satellites, and related articles, was based on the recommendations of the report. The proposed rule came out a little over a year ago in May of 2013. The interim final rule just came out last month in May of 2014. These changes for Category 15, which I'll talk about, are going to take effect on the 10th of November, with one major exception, and that's radiation-hardened components, which I'll talk about. That actually takes effect on the 27th of June, in other words, Friday or tomorrow. Also, Category 4, launch vehicles, changes are going to take effect on the 1st of July. That's just next week, with the exception of the provision on defense services, which will not take effect until the 10th of November. So let's look at what the changes to Category 15 mean specifically. Most importantly, what it did is it narrowed the kind of spacecraft and the kind of satellites that we're going to control on the ITAR. Now, Category 15A still controls 12 specific types of spacecraft, and they're designed mainly by specified functions and performance parameters. In other words, they've set up a positive list. Communications in remote sensing satellites without these listed functions are no longer controlled by the ITAR. But what I'm going to do is first talk about what's covered by the new Category 15, and then we will talk in more detail about what's not covered and what's been moved over to the AAR side. So my intent is not to talk about all 12 categories here, but instead I'll put them up on the slides, and I will highlight a few of the more notable of the changes. For example, on this slide, item number 3, the third item, refers to spacecraft that conduct SIGINT, which stands for Signals Intelligence, or MASINT, which stands for Measurement in Signature Intelligence. This slide shows additional types of satellites and spacecraft with these specific capabilities that are covered. Let me point out here, when it comes to remote sensing satellites, only certain types are going to be covered. I'll point out specifically that those with active electronically scanned array, otherwise known as IESA radar, are covered. Synthetic aperture radar, or SAR, is covered. Inverse SAR, ultra-wideband SAR, with the exception of those having a center frequency equal to or greater than 10 gigahertz or having a bandwidth less than 300 gigahertz. Also point out that satellites providing positioning, navigation, timing signals will be covered unless they provide only a differential correction broadcast. So again, there have been some carve-outs provided from some of these categories, the 12 categories covered. Also, satellites in spacecraft with these capabilities on this slide are covered. Note that suborbital and human habitat spacecraft has received a lot of attention. I note that of the 395 pages of commentary on the ITAR rule, a lot of the comments, a good portion of the comments were directed on this. I will come back a little bit later and talk more about impact on space tourism and other areas of this. Final item here is that classified spacecraft are covered, as well as spacecraft containing classified hardware or software. That shouldn't really be any surprise to those of you in the industry. Next category, 15B, specifies types of ground control systems that are going to be covered or continue to be covered by the ITAR. And we're looking at those specifically, or I should say specially designed, that's the new criteria, specially designed telemetry tracking and control system, but only those used for Category 15A systems. So it's limited to Cat 15A spacecraft. If it's intended for an EAR-covered satellite or spacecraft, a commercial communication satellite spacecraft, for example, it's not going to be covered by 15B. Also, very importantly, note that it excludes parts that are not unique for use with Cat 15A spacecraft and ground control systems. So in other words, if you have a part that's used for both ground control for an EAR system in a Cat 15A satellite, it is not going to be considered unique, and therefore it will not be covered by Cat 15B. Part C of Category 15 covers GPS receiving equipment. It only applies to the GPS receiving equipment that's specially designed for military applications, or those designed for encryption, decryption, or those designed for reduced jamming, or those for use with missiles. Note here that MT, or missile technology controls, will apply if the item is designed or modified for airborne operations, or if it's designed for use with rockets, missiles, submarine launched vehicles, drones, or UAVs controlled by the USML. Worth paying attention to this because we should expect forthcoming changes to Category 12, which is currently under interagency review. Category 12, as you know, is fire control, rangefinder, optical and guidance and control equipment. You can expect that some of these items will be moved to Category 12 later. Not a decontrol or not a move to the EAR. It just means that some of these items may be moved to Category 12 when that comes out at a later date. So worth watching for. Perhaps among the most significant changes to Category 15 will be taking effect tomorrow on the 27th of June. And these entirely remove the old Category 15D, which you notice under the new regulation, the interim final rule is reserved. So they removed that whole category altogether. And radiation-hardened microelectronic integrated circuits. So those of you in the industry know that in space, of course, satellites and spacecraft are constantly bombarded with ionizing radiation, which over time tends to fry electronic circuits. Therefore, they have to have a special coating to protect them from that ionizing radiation. We note that this is not a case of decontrol per se, because microelectronic circuits will now be controlled on the Commerce Control List side. They will be controlled by ECCN 9A515D. Software for such will be controlled under 9D515, and tech data will be controlled under ECCN 9E515. And I'll also point out, very important to see the specific language of the interim final rule, because it points out that a number of electronic circuits in the past have not just been controlled by category 15D, but by 15E. And they were controlled specifically because the very broad language that was controlled, the specifically designed language, that old language, controlled even radiation-tolerant circuits. And is separately identified from radiation hardened. And the good news is that that language makes clear that even that the ITAR will no longer control those radiation tolerant types of components, the old 15E. They will now be instead covered by ECCN 9A515E. But take a look at the text of the interim final rule notice. It makes clear that these radiation tolerant components will not be controlled. Just be aware that that doesn't mean that the microelectronic circuits, if they contain a military intelligence function, will not be controlled elsewhere. Pay particular attention to forthcoming Rule 11C, which will control integrated circuits. But also point out, take a look at ECCN 3A001, which controls integrated circuits for resistance to electromagnetic pulse. So the main point here is just be aware that there may be other controls that may apply to integrated circuits, but the fact of being radiation hardened or radiation tolerant alone will no longer be a cause for control. So I just talked about a little bit about CAT 15E and specifically the removal of the old specifically designed catch-all criteria. And what they've done here is replaced the old 15E category with a new positive list with 21 enumerated types of parts. And I won't go through all 21, but I will highlight a few as we go through here. But the good news is if you have a part that's not specifically named and does not meet any of the specially designed criteria, then it's going to be moved over to the EAR side. So I'm not going to discuss all 21 types of parts, but let me point out a few things here. You notice a number of items include space qualified characteristics. If you look at note 3 in the interim final rule, it comes up with a new definition for space qualified. By the way, there's a similar rule on the EAR side, which you will find in section 772.1. But this new space qualified definition includes parts designed, manufactured, or qualified through a successful testing for operations at altitudes greater than 100 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. So there's this new criteria that is going to apply for those space qualified parts that we're talking about. Notice the last item on this list, it talks about space qualified kinetic or directed energy systems. That will only apply to systems specifically designed for A5, that's anti-satellite systems, or A6, which is space to ground weapon systems. In addition to the parts on the previous slide, these parts and components, accessories, attachments, equipment, and systems will also be covered or continue to be covered by the ITAR. Mentioned space qualified atomic clocks. Also, components of those space qualified atomic clocks will be covered. Talks about altitude determination control systems. only those with specific geolocation accuracy. And again, every one of these categories or subcategories you need to look at very careful because there are going to be more specific criteria contained in the language of the regulation. The sixth item on this list refers to pounds force as a measurement of thrust. These additional items on this slide are covered, these parts, components, accessories, etc. Notice that space qualified oscillator for Cat 15 radar includes only those with specified noise levels. Again, you need to look to the regulation to see the specific criteria they've got. There's also a space qualified star tracker sensor with specified accuracy. Again, the regulation contains specific criteria. Also, spacecraft heat shields or heat sinks that are designed for reentry. Only those designed for reentry that are covered. And the final two items of parts and components that are covered up here include equipment, modules, stages or compartments with propulsion or separation from another spacecraft, but not attitude control. Does not include that type of propulsion that's designed solely for attitude control. Classified components are covered, should be no surprise there, but it's important for me to point out that it also includes those components containing classified software or those that were developed with classified information. And very importantly, note it also includes items classified by another government or international organization. This is something that you may need professional assistance with, or our company can help you determine. And the final point, there's note 2 to this part of the regulation, which points out that parts are subject to the EAR when prior to export are integrated into and included as an integral part of an item subject to the EAR. So in other words, even though that part itself may be ITAR controlled, if it becomes integrated in an integral part of a satellite, it may qualify for the criteria of Note 2, where that item is subject to the EAR. And next item is category 15F, technical data and defense services. Now, it should be fairly obvious that any kind of technical data or services directly related to articles remaining on the ITAR list, that is, articles that continue to be defined as defense articles, in particularly section 15A through E. But it also includes, of course, classified technical data, regardless of jurisdiction of the article. Doesn't matter if the article is now controlled by 9A515 or 9B515 or 9D515. The technical data is classified. The ITAR is going to continue to control that, so regardless of jurisdiction. Also, satellite and spacecraft integration onto a launch vehicle, for example. Regardless of jurisdiction and regardless of ownership and regardless of origin of the satellite or spacecraft or whether tech data is used, that is still going to be continued to be controlled by the ITAR. That includes planning and support. Likewise, too, the new regulation quite clearly makes launch failure analysis covered by the ITAR. Again, regardless of jurisdiction, regardless of ownership, or regardless of origin of the satellite or spacecraft, or whether tech data is used. That includes training for launch failure analysis as well. Now, it's important for me to point out that in addition to these changes to Cat 15, there's also a change to the ITAR section 124.15b to conform to these 15F changes. As those of you familiar with that part of the ITAR know, these are special controls which require licenses for launch failure investigation of satellites launched from a foreign country. That includes satellites subject to the AAR. So any kind of launch failure analysis, doesn't matter the jurisdiction, ITAR satellite or AAR satellite, that launch failure investigation is going to require a license. There is an exception, however. That exception and 125 4.15 B includes exception for NATO and major non-NATO allies. But just a word of warning here, if you look at the language of subparagraph C, there's discretionary authority given to DDTC to apply additional controls even for those NATO and major non-NATO allies. Also, along with this too, watch for a new separate final rule that will be coming out on defense services. The original proposed rule came out in May of 2013. The language you should expect to look very similar to the language of CAT 15F up here. But that separate rule will be coming out sometime in the not so distant future. Very importantly, let's talk about what CAT 15 does not cover. It does not cover technical data directly related to articles for CAT 15C, which is GPS related systems, or CAT 15E components when they are integrated into a satellite subject to the EAR. Again, it has to be an integral part of that satellite and integrated prior to the export. Also, very importantly, note 2 of category 15F talks about the space passenger experience. This actually dates back to a commodity jurisdiction decision that was made in my time. In fact, I helped write this decision. And space passenger experience carved out certain areas that are neither ITAR nor EAR controlled, if limited to the following. Number 1, spacecraft access, ingress, egress, including the operation of spacecraft doors, hatches, and airlocks. Secondly, physiological training for the space passenger experience. Thirdly, medical evaluation or assessment for spaceflight. Next, training for operation of health and safety related hardware in the spacecraft. Next, viewing of interior or exterior spacecraft terrestrial mock-ups. Also, observing basic spacecraft operations, such as pre-flight checks, landing, in-flight status. Also, training for operating participant equipment. That does not include operating the spacecraft itself, just basic participant equipment. And finally, the wearing and utilization of a flight suit, spacesuit, and associated equipment.
Chuck?
Sure.
I would just point out that if the companies, individuals listening in have questions about some of the specifics related to the activities or the data that you're talking about,
sure,
they should get in touch with you or others from MK, and we can discuss your perspectives and make sure that you can formulate your views and thoughts so that you can communicate them directly to the appropriate agency. Because again, I would know this is an interim final rule, and the Commerce and State Departments and others would like to hear your observations or thoughts about how exactly these activities and data are defined and how you see them.
Yep, absolutely. You know, that's a good point to mention too, that the comment period is open. Comment period on Category 15 is open through the 27th of June, which is tomorrow. So, very important to get the comments in shortly before tomorrow. Okay, one of the last items on the slide is that of what we frequently refer to as housekeeping data, and that is that health operational status, basic function, raw sensor data are going to be controlled by EAR 99. That specifically limited, very basic telemetry data is not going to be covered by the ITAR. And the final section of Category 15, subsection X, very similar to other revised parts of the USML, provides that when used in or with defense articles controlled under Category 15, single ITAR license can be used to cover incorporated EAR commodities software. It doesn't change the jurisdiction of the subcomponents, but what it does is it allows the ease of using a single license to cover the export of these items. It's not the perfect solution, but it's a step in the right direction towards single licensing. And as you may remember, That was one of Secretary Gates's goals in export control reform. So what does this mean in terms of items moved to the Commerce Control List? Well, first of all, communication satellites without classified components generally going to be moved over to the EAR side, to Commerce Control List 500 series. This also means that remote sensing satellites without USML specified performance parameters, that is, lower performing remote sensing, also based on aperture size, those type of remote sensing satellites will be moved to the CCL side. Also, components, parts, accessories that are not specifically identified in Category 15E will be moved over to the CCL side. And finally, most radiation-hardened microelectronic circuits. And the only reason why I say most as opposed to all, it's not that they will be continue to be controlled simply by virtue of being radiation hardened or radiation tolerant. The only caveat I throw in is because of other controls for other performance characteristics related to military or intelligence functions, such as the new Category 11C or forthcoming Category 11C. And be aware, the other controls I mentioned, ECCN 3A001 for EMP, for example. So, again, most important to know, this is not about decontrol of these items. This is simply moving them over to the Commerce Control List. And by the way, most of these are going to still require license, with a few of the license exceptions, which we'll talk about. So what does this mean in terms of Commerce Control List types of controls? First of all, most of these items are moving over to Category 9 of the Commerce Control List. And Category 9, as most of you know, controls aerospace and propulsion. There are 4 product groups on the Commerce Control List side. Category A, referred to up here, 9A515. Category Product Group A refers to systems, equipment, and components. Product Group B refers to test, inspection, and production equipment. And Product Group D refers to software, and Product Group E refers to technology. Now, there are a number of advantages of Commerce Control List controls as opposed to the ITAR. Generally, they're less demanding than the ITAR. For example, there are no licensing fees or registration requirements under the AAR. You may export or re-export to end users that are listed on the license. Generally, there are more tailored controls depending on the end use and end user. It's not a one-size-fits-all type of licensing regime. Generally, less documentation is required under the AAR. For example, no need for a purchase order or a contract under the EAR. But be aware that there are special requirements that are going to apply to the new 500 series and the new 600 series as well. And these are unique, unlike the rest of the EAR. For example, there's a zero de minimis for D5, that is arms embargoed countries. So for those D5 countries, there is zero de minimis. Otherwise, for other countries, it's a 25% de minimis rule. So the new 500 series, most of the controls are very similar to the 600 series. The types of controls that will apply are NS1 or national security controls, regional security or RS1 controls, AT1, anti-terrorism, and some of the items, missile technology or MT controls will apply. There is a new space qualified catch-all on the Commerce Control List that's 9A515X, or any kind of space qualified components or systems. By the way, the International Space Station will continue to be controlled under 9A004, not the 500 series. Let's take a look at the licensing exceptions that will apply. Let me at the start mention that the license exceptions will not apply for any of the D5 embargo destinations, none of the arms embargo destinations that I had mentioned, with one exception. The government exports exception, the GOV exception, will apply and can be used for some of the D5 countries. I note, for example, Iraq and Afghanistan happen to be on the D5 list. And anyway, government exports, different category. But you cannot use the other exceptions for the D5 countries. The other exceptions including, of course, limited value shipments up to $1,500 of the LVS shipments to Group B countries, for example. That's the license exception. Temporary exports, license exception. And perhaps the most commonly used is that of servicing and replacement of parts, or the RPL exception. Very common. I think we call that repair and return on the ITAR side. Anyway, on the commerce side, that special exception. Also, a fairly new exception, that of the strategic trade authorization exception, subject to specific conditions. But if you happen to be one of those 36 countries that qualify for that, or the destination is one of those 36 countries, this may be useful. Just be aware of the special conditions and special documentation requirements for the 500 series that apply here. Also, the 500 series is subject to the same direct product rule as the 600 series. Now, this means that certain foreign-made products that are the direct result of U.S. origin technology or software are subject to the EAR when re-exported to D1, D3, D4, D5, or E1 countries. And very importantly, important requirement for the 500 series is all 500 series must be, exports must be filed with the automatic export system, regardless of whether an exception is used or not. Must be filed with the AES system, regardless of value or the destinations. There's also a special destination control statement that may apply in certain cases. There's no post-departure filing allowed. But very importantly, you should remember to list the ECCN on the invoice, bill of lading, or any other export control documentation that accompanies the shipment. It's important to list that ECCN so that the officials at the port of entry or port of departure will see which of the ECCNs is applying, whether an exception is being applied. Very importantly for the 500 series and the 600 series as well, there are certain prohibited and restricted destinations. This was part of the law when Congress had agreed to authorize transfer of certain items over to the Commerce Control List, that they would keep in place certain restrictions and prohibitions. First off, with country group E1, the so-called terrorist supporting countries that included on that list, the E1 list, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Sudan, and Syria. And to that list, they've also added, in addition to E1 countries, they've also added China. And a policy of denial will apply to any exports to those destinations. And in addition, there's a restricted group of countries, that is country group D5. Those are the U.S. arms embargoed countries. It's a very long list. I won't read all of them. But just a few of the countries listed include Somalia, Burma, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, etc. And the policy here is to review consistent with ITAR 126.1. Now, those familiar with 126.1 knows it's a list of restrictions on countries. It doesn't necessarily mean all exports are banned. In some cases, it may mean non-lethal exports are allowed, which probably will apply to most of the exports when it comes to the on the category 15 or 500 series side. So there is also a forthcoming change to category 4, which will be effective next month in July. And launch vehicles, a few of the changes may not seem that particularly relevant to the space industry, such as demolition blocks, blasting caps, military explosive excavating devices. However, ablative materials, which may be relevant to, for example, certain materials used for re-entry vehicles, may be relevant. that is going to be moved to Cat 13, Category 13D, miscellaneous materials. But very importantly for everyone in the space-related industry is removal of the catch-all, the old catch-all wording of subsection H. And again, use that old specifically designed criteria applying to any kind of components designed for launch vehicles or vehicles covered by Category 4. What they've done is remove the old catch-all language and replaced with a positive list of specifically enumerated items, 1 through 30. And I won't read all 30 of the items, but just a few of the types of things they've included are flight control systems, seeker systems, nose tips, fairings, separation mechanisms, propellant tanks, combustion chambers, and motor casings. So the most important thing to know, if it's not listed as a part in H, it's not one of those 30 enumerated items, that means it's moved to the 600 series. And it's not the 500 series, it's the 600 series when it comes to formally controlled by Category 4. And finally, there's a new subpart X, similar to other parts of the ITAR, and including Category 15. X allows for single licensing, the single ITAR license to even include those subcomponents that are covered by, that may be subject to the EAR. Category 4 also includes a separate section that applies to technical data and defense services. By the way, this will not take effect in July. This is actually was part of the interim final rule that came out last month along with Category 15. This will not take effect until the 10th of November of this year. First off, this will cover the obvious, which is technical data and services directly related to defense articles. That's articles that continue to be controlled by Category 4, A through H. It also includes classified technical data and services, even if it applies to items moved over to the Commerce Control List side, such as the ECCNs that I have listed up here. Classified tech data and services will still be covered, and services including use of classified technical data. This is, by the way, very similar to the new and pending category, Category 15F, which controls services concerning satellite launch vehicle integration and launch failure analysis. That you'll notice a parallel between those two languages. The purpose of this change was to bring convergence between the languages, the two separate parts of the ITAR. So what does this mean in terms of, what do all these changes mean in terms of impact on business? It is a big impact on exporters, manufacturers, and shippers, and anybody involved in the space industry. For one thing, the new categories where they specifically call out items are going to supersede prior CJ commodity jurisdiction determinations. Those new lists are going to supersede the old commodity jurisdiction determinations. It is still likely that even for those items transferred to the 500 and 600 series, that an export license will be required, a BIS, Bureau of Industry and Security license, or Department of Commerce license. But overall, we're looking about 50% of what used to be covered, 50% of licenses or articles covered under the ITAR licenses will now be moved over to the Commerce Control List side. It also means that manufacturing license agreement may not be needed if the items that are being manufactured overseas are no longer controlled on the USML, because there is no such thing as a manufacturing license on the EAR side. Also, defense services, where they do not apply to items moved over to the Commerce Control List side, means that no technical assistance agreement will be required. But be careful for those remaining areas of defense services, such as classified tech data and services, that those will still require an ITAR license. As I mentioned earlier, on the EAR side, it may qualify for one of the special license exceptions. Again, remember special rules for 500 and 600 series. But again, strategic trade authorization, shipments of limited value, temporary exports exception, servicing replacements of parts, government to intergovernmental organizations, exports. Be aware that those apply. But like I said, 500 and 600 series are unique, and not all the usual EAR exceptions will necessarily apply. So be careful to heed the special rules of 500 and 600 series.
Chuck?
Sure.
Yeah, Chuck, I would also note, I know before you get into some of the aspects about brokering, I would just note that, that from what we've heard, some of the larger companies, that they have devoted extensive training of new employees and training time for existing employees, including engineering staff, to make sure they're familiar with the right way to view and classify the parts and their components and accessories. You can't emphasize enough the need to review the adequacy of your training and training resources to make sure that proper classification is going on. And I'd also note as well that for projects and activities involving ITAR and EAR controlled items, we stress a team-based approach with consultants who are very knowledgeable on both ITAR and EAR. So, thanks.
Yeah, quite right. And I'll actually talk about that a little bit more when we talk about best practices coming up very shortly. One final two notes on this slide I wanted to mention is when I say not all EAR exceptions will apply to 500 and 600 series, be especially wary that if the destination is an embargoed country, no exception will apply under the new rules. And the final point I would make is if your products are on the EAR side, brokering, registration, and licensing will not be required. So let's just take a look very quickly at what we should see ahead in terms of export control reforms. I think I mentioned a little earlier, Category 11 military electronics that recently cleared 38F notification to Congress. We should expect to see a new rule on military electronics. That's probably going to impact some of the same manufacturers of other space components in the near. We should expect that in the near future. There are three other categories that will be coming out fairly soon. They're currently under interagency review. They include Category 12 for fire control mechanisms, Category 14 for toxicological agents, Category 18 for directed energy weapons. These are all under interagency review, but you may expect to be seeing proposed rules out fairly shortly on those. But export control reform has really come a long way in the last few years, especially regarding satellites in related items. But I note, reading through 395 pages of commentary. I didn't read through all 395, but I read through enough to note that there's still a lot of, we still have a ways to go. And there, even though we've made some good progress here, there further changes may make sense. So what are we looking at in the future? After implementation, for example, of the new rules on remote sensing satellites, I think we can expect perhaps some further adjustments, further prospects towards adjusting the criteria in liberalizing the controls on remote sensing satellites. I also think in terms of commercial space flight, particularly the dependence of NASA on the commercial or domestic space launch industry, I think we may see some changes in the not so distant future, particularly when it comes to manned space flight and manned spacecraft. That very important national policy to build up and support the domestic launch industry, important to national security. And hopefully we should also be seeing maybe some liberalization of the controls when it comes to launch vehicle integration, specifically in the area for EAR satellites. You know, how much do we need to control on that side? That will be the subject of a continuing dialogue, including all the vested interests from the Department of Defense and NASA and industry, if that dialogue continues. But the 1248 study, I think, was a very good start that by identifying items that no longer required USML control. But we need to look at taking the next steps and continuing to refine the criteria uh, to improve uh, to maintain the health of our domestic space-related industry. So let's wrapping up with the look at what this means in terms of best practices. The most important thing I could recommend to all companies out there, be they large companies, medium-sized, or small companies, is to actively manage the transition. I think as Frank already noted, some of the bigger companies we're familiar with have spent a lot of resources, a lot of money, dedicated a lot of manpower to actively managing the change. I have to say, at the front, at dedicating these resources, it's really a front end loaded effort. It's one of these things where it requires expenditure of time and manpower, but in the end, in the long run, it will actually your company will reap gains from the investment. It's important to reclassify those export products. I would recommend check out the USML, the U.S. munitions list first as revised, depending on the implementation dates, and look for your product. If it's not listed on the USML, and uh, you should go to the Commerce Control List and see if it's more specifically described on the commerce end. If necessary, you can get either a commodity jurisdiction determination or a CCAS, but I think there's fairly detailed guidance. Or you can get assistance from a professional organization, professional consultants like us on that subject. Also, it's important to educate your supplier base and distribution chain and foreign partners about the classification of your products. It's also important to obtain a BIS license for re-exports and retransfers of articles that have been moved over to the Commerce Control List. And also important to ask if your product is covered by a pre-existing DSP-5 export license or a technical assistance agreement or a manufacturing license agreement. Has an optional grandfathering clause. The optional grandfathering provision's been applied. And if so, does it meet all the required conditions to that grandfathering provision, which can apply to for 2 years. And very important recommendation that we've been advised by Commerce Department is take advantage of the opportunity to pre-position a license. If you know the product is moved over to the 500 series or the 600 series, you can actually submit a license application to Commerce Department for review even before the implementation date. It will go nowhere, or actually can be internally reviewed before the implementation date. But that's a way of pre-positioning. It also helps out Commerce Department by not having all the licenses show up on their doorstep on the 10th of November this year. But anyway, it's a smart tactic to pre-position to the extent you can your license on the for BIS review. It goes without saying to know the commodity jurisdiction or commodity classification of your products. And that's important too, to know that the ITAR and EAR, despite the efforts at convergence, they're still really separate compliance systems, and it's important to prepare and keep proper documentation to comply with both systems. Also, be very careful of any modifications to your product that may change jurisdiction or classification. Be careful to document properly, and be very cognizant of that new specially designed criteria. It may be worth reviewing that criteria when you look at any modifications or potential modifications to your product. And the final point I would make would be learn the new rules for the 500 and 600 series of exports. The rules are unique for the AR with the application of license exceptions, for example. There are unique rules when it comes to AES requirements for filing. Unique rules for prohibited destinations, and very importantly for record keeping. So anyway, with that, I think I've covered the changes to for the space-related industry, and I think now would be a good time to turn it over to the audience, and our panel will be happy to entertain questions from program participants.
Okay, thank you very much, Chuck. First question here. It says, commercial communication satellites provided for Earth orbital flight have integrated propulsion other than that required for altitude control. Does this mean that COMSATs are controlled by the ITAR?
Generally speaking, no. And by the way, it's actually attitude control, not altitude control.
Okay.
In attitude, referring to the direction of the vehicle or spacecraft. But no, generally commercial communication satellites are not going to be controlled.
Okay. Next question here. Can MK provide my company with license support through the commodity jurisdiction and classification process, especially if there are continuing delays in the commodity jurisdiction determination?
Yeah, the answer is yes. Yeah, and there you have to take special care if you have a commodity jurisdiction determination waiting. And I remember from my days as director of policy that pending a commodity jurisdiction determination, generally the safe course of action is the presumption that it will be ITAR controlled until the commodity jurisdiction determines otherwise. But at the same time, I would point out too that there's fairly detailed instructions with the new Category 15 that should make it a lot easier than previously was the case in determining whether your article is covered or not. And to that, I would add too that it's advisable to have professional consultants like us perhaps take a look before you submit a commodity jurisdiction determination to see if it's a valid question for a CJ or whether the current regulations would cover it.
Okay.
And yes, we can help with license applications. We have a number of experts who help with the licensing process.
Okay. Well, so far those are the only questions we've received. Frank or Paul, if you guys want to add anything, feel free to. If not, the webinar will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, so if people want to ask questions after they watch it, for a second time, feel free to comment on the page and leave whatever questions you may have, and we'll answer them as soon as possible.
Let me just add one thing to the last question. A thought just occurred to me. Going back to my days at DDTC, it is advisable to submit a request for an ITAR license pending a CGA determination. A request or an application for an ITAR license will not prejudice the CGA determination. It does not mean simply because you submitted out of an abundance of caution have submitted an application for an ITAR license does not predetermine or mean that that the CJ in any way will result in an ultimate determination that it is ITAR controlled. So the main point here is submitting an application for an ITAR license will not hurt your chances of later qualifying for control on the commerce control list side.
This is Paul. I'd like to add one thing to that. When you're talking about both CJs and submitting a classification, you really do, time is of the essence. You don't want to submit a request, commodity jurisdiction request, that's poorly drafted, because that means you're not going to get anywhere with it. So if you care about the time, there's time sensitivity in it, you really do want a professional consultant, such as the people that we have working here at MK, to both guide you in the drafting and to look over the submission before it's given to government, because time is money, and you just don't want to waste time by taking a stab at it rather than actually having a professional submission.
Yeah, one thing I might add to that very good comment about submitting CJs, from my experience in the CJ process, a lot of times we would spend additional effort trying to get additional information from
Right.
the applicant. And therefore, it's very important to have full information. For example, the types of things that we would look for in the commodity jurisdiction process was there government funding? Absolutely important to. Now, of course, we came up with a new CJ form when I was at DDTC. We helped design it to ferret out all that type of information. So I think the new CJ form should be very good. But nevertheless, um, as Paul stated, it's very important how you put it in the application, because that will certainly frame the determination. And so things like design intent, for example, especially in light of the new specially designed criteria, government funding. And by the way, government funding, we had a lot of products that were funded by DARPA, for example, and typically there'd be a clause that would say the item is intended for both civil and military applications. Mere funding by the government will not necessarily guarantee that will result in an ITAR determination. Especially if it's contemplated for both military and civilian applications. It really is going to depend on the level of sensitivity of the technology, and whether there are in fact legitimate applications on both sides, civil and military, and if the product also can be designed separated out those for military applications versus commercial or civilian applications.
And it's obvious from the number of people who've signed up for this Google Hangout that there are real questions about the new rules, the new regulations. So given the fact that thousands of items are switching from one list to another, you want to make sure that you're on the correct list. And if you haven't submitted a commodity jurisdiction request before, I think you want professional guidance on submitting that request. So just a word to the wise.
But if we have no further questions there, perhaps I should move to the key takeaway slide.
Yeah, I think we should just wrap it up.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks very much for listening.
Okay, so one of the just the key takeaways is that it's important that to know your commodities jurisdiction or classification. Is already mentioned by Paul and Frank. If in doubt, get help. We can help you with that. And it's important to update your compliance program based on these new changes, and it's going to be front-end loaded. It's going to require some dedication of resources, but in the long run, it will pay off. Very important to keep that communication open, keep your employees and business partners informed. So I will wrap up with that and invite Paul and Frank to add anything.
Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, and don't forget to comment on the rules. ITAR rule comment period ends tomorrow, and I believe the Commerce interim rule is you can comment through November, but it's very important to get industry comments in.
Okay, I guess we should just wrap it up then. Thanks for attending, everybody. And this, again, will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, and it will be posted on our website as well.